Hello, everyone. It's Maureen again from the Embryology Lab at CNY Fertility, Syracuse. I thought today we could just do mostly a Q&A. I don't have a specific topic to discuss today, so I'm going to wait a little bit, see if we get anyone logging on. I apologize, I'm on my phone, so we got this different camera going on. I didn't get my tablet charged in time, so forgive me for the phone camera. So while we wait for people to join, go ahead and start asking your questions. One thing I wanted to go over briefly was how often you're going to hear updates from the Embryology Lab. And you can always message us through the portal, your web messaging in your patient portal. That's probably the quickest and most effective way to get a hold of us, and we answer those every day. The most you'll have to wait is to the next day to get a response. So when you come for your egg retrieval, you'll get to talk to embryology right before your retrieval. We'll go over your consent forms and what your plan is for the cycle, whether you're doing a fresh transfer, freezing all embryos, or PGT testing. And then the same afternoon as your egg retrieval is when we're going to do the ICSI procedure. So we're doing the fertilization of the eggs. And the next morning, which is considered day 1, so the day after your egg retrieval is day 1, that's when we're going to check the eggs for fertilization. And a nurse is going to give you a call and let you know how many were fertilized, so how many embryos you're starting out with. And she's going to confirm your plan then. So the nurse is going to let us know your final plan, whether that's a transfer, PGT, or freezing embryos. And then you're probably not going to hear from the lab again until either your transfer day, or if we're freezing embryos, until we've finished freezing all embryos that develop appropriately. So at that time, we'll put reports in your portal, so it'll let you know how many were frozen, the grades of the embryos that are frozen, and we'll also include photos for you. So you're not going to hear too much from embryology after your egg retrieval day. If there's some sort of urgent need to get a hold of us, obviously call the main line. It can be a little tough to get through to the lab just because we're not actually sitting at our desks all day. We're in the lab doing work. So that's why we say the web messages are the best way to get a hold of us. But we do want to have a final plan day of retrieval, what we're doing that cycle. So we've been getting a lot of messages lately asking for day 3 updates, day 2 updates, day 4 updates. And we actually don't even check the embryos every single day. So we're going to update you at the end once we know how many embryos we have. Okay, so one of these questions, let's see. Thank you for your questions, everyone. Is it worth the risk to the embryo to thaw and rebiopsy an inconclusive PGT tested embryo? And in this case, it's a day 5 with a high graded embryo. I would say if your embryo is a day 5 and it's a good graded embryo, the chances of us thawing, rebiopsying, and getting a result on that embryo are pretty high. There is always a risk that we can't biopsy the embryo again, or it doesn't continue to grow and expand once we thaw it. But if it's a day 5, that gives it actually an extra day to grow, because we could end up biopsying it on day 6. And if it's got a good grade, that means that we started out with plenty of cells. I have seen some of our no result embryos, when we rebiopsy them, we do get a result. Oftentimes they're normal and they can be transferred. Anytime you're thawing your embryos for PGT, it's worth it to talk to the embryologist about, the quality of embryos, what you have left, and what your goal is, because there is going to be some risk anytime we're manipulating the embryos after they've already been frozen. So that was a great question. Thank you. Okay, so if we do a day 3 fresh transfer, do we get the report the day we come in for transfer? Yes. So if you're doing a day 3 fresh transfer, that means likely we are planning to also freeze the rest of the embryos on day 3. We can hold them to blast, or we can even do PGT testing, but most commonly, if you're doing a day 3 fresh transfer, we will freeze the other embryos on day 3. And you would get the report by the end of that day that lists the grades of the embryos and how many were frozen, but you should have a pretty good idea actually right before your transfer when the embryologist comes in to ID you and talk about what we have. We can give you a pretty good idea, like, oh, we'll transfer 1 and we have 3 to freeze and they're good grade or fair grade. We may not specifically grade them until right before we freeze them, but we do, we can go over that with you. So you would know that day. Do we have Pixie in addition to Zymot? We do have Pixie available. We do have Zymot as well. We probably wouldn't recommend doing both together. This is because once the sperm swims through the Zymot device, it's like a microchip, kind of how we describe it. So at the end of Zymot, we're going to have less sperm, but they're all going to be motile, but it can be a less concentration. So there's not as many sperm swimming around in the amount of fluid. So then when we try to do Pixie after that, we may not have a concentrated enough sample to successfully do the Pixie. We don't usually recommend Pixie unless you've spoken to a physician about it and they would recommend it. We don't do it that often, but theoretically it's possible, but I think we would have to see what we end up with once the sperm goes through the Zymot and see how much we're working with. Okay, a couple questions about having good embryos on day 3 and then not getting any blasts on day 5. So unfortunately, this can happen and it can be really hard to tell sometimes what's going on there. So we would look at your case specifically, look at your past cases, look at the quality of the sperm and the quality of the eggs. We do get a general impression of the egg quality when we're doing the ICSI procedure, so we can let you know if we have an inkling that it's an egg issue or a sperm issue. It's oftentimes very difficult to tell, but we would have to look at your specific case, look at what they really did look like on day 3. We have those pictures saved, speak with the physician and see if we can come up with any changes or what we think may have happened. So that's going to be specific to your case. Okay, so what are the odds of a 2-7 making it to day 5 if I decide to thaw and grow it out? So a 2-7 is a day 3 embryo, which is graded fair, and it has 7 cells. So the 2 would be fair, so it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 would be poor, 2 is fair, 3 and 4 is good. And then 7 cells is about what we're looking for on day 3, 6 to 8 cells. So unfortunately, that is right in the middle. So for a 2-7, it's really a 50-50 shot whether it's going to keep growing or if it's not going to grow. So we expect about 40 to 50% of day 3 embryos to make it to the blastocyst stage. It's a fair embryo. It has the right amount of cells, but I really couldn't tell you. It could go either way, unfortunately. Okay. Can you explain how a fresh transfer works versus a frozen? Okay, so in the embryology standpoint, if you're doing a fresh transfer, you have your egg retrieval, which is considered day 0. The next day is day 1. We let you know how many were fertilized, and we decide if we are going to do a day 3 transfer or a day 5 transfer. And typically that depends on how many embryos you're starting out with. So if you have 4 or 5 embryos, then we may do a day 3 transfer to make sure that you have something to transfer. It also depends on your age. If you have a lot of embryos and we feel pretty confident that you're going to have good embryos on day 5, we will hold them out. This allows us to kind of go through that natural selection process where some of those day 3 embryos aren't going to make it to day 5, but then we know we're transferring embryos that have proven to continue to grow, at least up to that point. So day 1, we'd schedule a day 3 or day 5 transfer with you. You would come in the morning of your transfer. I can't speak really to the medications that you're on or the protocol, but I know you do have some medications to prepare your lining for that transfer. The morning that you come in for your transfer, we'll show you photos of what the embryos look like, what we have, pick out what to transfer with you and the doctor. Then you'll have your transfer. For frozen transfers, you would have your egg retrieval. We would freeze all the embryos that develop appropriately. And then typically the next month, so after you get your period and then you start your frozen embryo transfer cycle, so you would call the nursing line, let them know you've started a new month, and they would schedule you for some monitoring, some testing, monitoring blood work. They'll monitor your lining, and they will schedule the frozen embryo transfer for when your body is ready to go. And then you just come in the day of your transfer. We thaw the embryo that morning, and it's ready for you when you get here. And then you have your transfer. The actual transfer itself is the same process, of course. This question says you have 2 day 6 blasts, but there are no grades. I would message the embryology lab. So we grade everything. If it comes from another center, sometimes they don't actually individually grade the embryos. So that would be the only reason why you would have frozen embryos without grades. We grade everything here. This question is probably more for a physician or a clinical team member, but we have very, very similar rates for our fresh transfers and our frozen transfers. So it's really what is best for your case and your body. I know an advantage of doing a frozen transfer is that you can wait and make sure everything is just lined up perfectly and ready to go. But like I said, our fresh and frozen transfer rates are virtually the same. And that's partly because of the freezing process now is so much more advanced than it used to be. So we use cryopreservation, vitrification. So it's a much safer, more reliable way to freeze and thaw embryos. So in the past, they may have leaned towards fresh embryo transfers because you're not risking the freezing and thawing of your embryos. But now it's a very robust system, I guess I could say. It's very effective. So we don't worry too much about freezing and thawing. All right, when do we know how many eggs are harvested during the egg retrieval? So it should be by the time you wake up or shortly after. So it's before you leave the OR. Before you leave the OR, you'll know how many eggs we retrieved. And that doesn't mean that all of them are mature, but it's your total number to start with. So you may get, 12 eggs, and then a little bit later that afternoon, we're going to evaluate them. We strip off the outer layer of cells that are surrounding the egg so we can look at the egg itself and see if it's mature. So we can only ICSI or fertilize the mature eggs. And then the next morning, day 1, we check to see what's fertilized. So then when the nurse calls you on day 1, she'll review, okay, you had 12 eggs retrieved. We were able to inject 10 of them and nine fertilized. So something like that. But you'll know how many you're starting off with before you leave the OR. Okay, this is a good question. All right. So this is asking about when you're buying donor sperm from the sperm bank, can you use not the whole vial? So yes, we do have the option sometimes to use just half a vial of donor sperm. So you could possibly get 2 uses out of 1 vial of sperm. So we would thaw the vial and we would only process half of it and we would refreeze the other half. Now you have to have a certain type of sample. So when you're ordering from the sperm banks, it's like IUI or ICI. The only one that can be used just once is if it's an IVF only vial, because that's a much smaller sample. That's just for they give us a smaller amount because they know that we're doing ICSI. So if you have an IVF only vial, or if you have a straw from a certain sperm bank, like a cryos is frozen in a straw instead of a vial, so we have to thaw the whole thing. And then most recently, we've been preferring to use the whole vial if it comes from Zytex, just the way we thaw their sperm. We've found out that when we thaw half, we oftentimes have to thaw the other half in order to have a really good sample. It could just be the way our labs work together. So that's a good question based on what sperm you have, what sperm bank it came from. But yeah, it is possible to get 2 uses out of 1 vial in some circumstances. I hope that answered your question. All right, let's see. If your options were a highly graded untested embryo or a lower graded euploid, which would you choose? I'm probably going to suggest the euploid embryo. I say that because sometimes our higher graded embryos can still come back as abnormal, and the lower graded embryos can come back as euploid. So grading, it's very subjective, and we're just looking at one aspect of the embryo. We're looking at how it looks, like a beauty contest. So it's not actually telling us anything about the DNA of that embryo. So once you have the PGT results and you know that the chromosomes are normal, we would choose to go by the PGT results rather than the grades. So for this question, is touching again on when you'll know how many eggs you have. So you'll know how many eggs were retrieved when you wake up from your egg retrieval. And then the next day is when you find out how many were able to be injected and fertilized. Some of these questions are more based towards the nursing team. So if I'm skipping your question, that would be why. Like questions about IVF protocols, medications, what is safe for you to have in terms of coffee, stuff like that would be questions for your nurses. Okay, so this question is, do we use calcium ionophore? No, we don't use that in our lab. And then is it possible to mature eggs in the lab? So if you have an egg retrieval and all your eggs are immature for some reason, we will hold them until the next morning to see if they mature overnight, and oftentimes they do. And then we would be able to do the ICSI in the morning. So that's called a late ICSI. So if for some reason you didn't have any mature eggs on the day of your retrieval, we can check them the next day. And I have seen recently, we did have a live birth from a late ICSI'd embryo. So that was cool to see that it does work. Okay. Yeah, so questions about, how to get more mature eggs out of your retrievals. That would be a question for the providers about your protocols. Asking about that sperm sample again. We can definitely, use the same vial twice with success. I would probably ask the andrology team. They may have a little more information about, which sperm bank you're using, or if you have a sample in storage right now, they can might have more information for you. But yeah, we do the half and half quite often. And since we're doing an ICSI procedure, we're under the microscope picking out one sperm at a time. So it shouldn't be too risky that we would have, no sperm if we use it twice. As long as the first thaw goes well, it should be fine. So this is a question about day 3 or day 5. You know, your physician is a good person to ask based on your history. If you've done IVF in the past, in general, if you are going to have a lot of eggs, like, you know, in the 20s or 30s, we would lean towards a day 5 transfer. So that way, you know, we're going to have some drop off. Not all the day 3 embryos are going to make it to day 5, but that's what we expect. So by holding to day 5, we're able to transfer just the embryos that have shown that they are continuing to grow, at least to that point. We get this question a lot about transferring more than one embryo if it's PGT tested and it comes back normal. We really recommend not to do that. You know, one euploid embryo can split into twins, and it happens. If you do 2 euploid embryos, you could end up with quadruplets. It really does happen. So any pregnancy with multiples is going to be higher risk for mom and babies. So we're trying to get you a take-home baby, and we're trying to do it safely. So we really do recommend one euploid embryo at a time, and we're following guidelines from ASRM. That's American Society for Reproductive Medicine. So we follow their guidelines. Okay, can you have an egg retrieval and do a fresh transfer and then freeze the rest of the eggs that you retrieve for a future pregnancy? Yes, definitely. That is typically what we do in most cases. So once you do your fresh transfer, whether it's day 3 or day 5, any embryos that developed appropriately to that stage, we can freeze, and then in the future, you can thaw them and do a frozen embryo transfer. So it works out really nicely for some people when they get to have multiple successes from one retrieval. California Cryobank does an IVF package with 2 small vials for the price of 1 full vial. So you would use the full vial. Yes. So if they have a package, I'm not familiar with this, but from what it sounds like, if they have a package where you're getting the 2 IVF vials for the price of 1 IUI vial, then yeah, we would use, you could get 2 retrievals out of that. We would use the whole vial though, because they would be smaller. But same price. That's nice. That's a nice package. I hadn't heard of that. Another question about transferring euploid embryos and the grading. If you're deciding between 2 embryos that are euploid, then we would defer to the grade. So we would probably go with the higher graded euploid embryo, even though it's a day 6. That might vary between labs. It's really embryologist preference. They might look at the photos, but if they're both euploid, probably go with the higher grade. Using zero motility sperm a bad idea? So it depends on where the sperm is coming from. Is it a ejaculate sample or a PESA or a TESA? We have a media, it's called pentoxy, that we can put the sperm in to see if they will move. So if we're looking at the sperm in our regular media and they're not swimming, we have this other media that we can put it in. It's called pentoxy, and it's basically like caffeine for sperm. So if the sperm are alive, they should perk up and swim around in the pentoxy. So if we put the sperm in the pentoxy and it's still not moving, then we just can't tell whether the sperm is alive or not, which is why we don't want to inject sperm with zero motility. But I would see message your embryology team or your andrology team and see what exactly that means for zero motility. So sometimes when they're looking at a sperm sample, the way they're calculating things, if they're seeing very, very rare amounts of sperm, they put in the volume, the concentration, all this stuff, it might come out to zero motility, but they will note like 2 motile sperm seen off grid, which is like off to the side. So I would want to look at where that sample came from and if it truly is zero motility or if there is a chance of motile sperm somewhere in there. It's just a very low concentration and we may need to search for it, which we've done. We've searched for probably 5 hours on some of these sperm samples to find sperm for ICSI. So we really do, all we can in order to use motile sperm for injection. All right, I'm just looking through the questions here. These are all great questions. Just catch my breath for a second. Ronald, I see you asked a question a few times. I would message your embryology team. I don't know the specifics of your case, but I definitely can look into that for you. So the chances of a frozen embryo not surviving, so we have about, a 98-99% survival rate. It's definitely over 95%. So especially if the embryos were frozen at our center here, we're using, the same protocol to thaw that we did to freeze. It's the same media, same, procedure, just basically in reverse. So we have pretty good thaw rates. If you have multiple 4AA blasts, how does the embryologist choose what to transfer first? We would start with the day 5s, and then if you have a lot of day 5 4AAs, we just pick one. So it's kind of up to chance. Sometimes if we have a case with, a lot of really good embryos, we might star one when we're freezing them, just as a note to ourselves, like, oh, we really like this one. But again, it's just kind of a beauty contest. All right, just looking at the questions here. Okay, so here's a question about Blastocyst grading. So on day 5 and 6 and even 7, we are grading the embryos with letters and numbers. So the numbers are 1 through 6. So 1 and 2 are going to be early blastocysts. They're a little more compact. They're not really expanded yet. 3 and 4 are going to be expanded blastocysts. So they're getting a little bigger. And then 5 is when it starts to hatch. So a hatching embryo. And 6 would be if it totally hatched out and came out of the zona, came out of that shell. And then the next part of the grade are the letters. So it's A, B, C. A is good, B is fair, C is poor. So if you have blastocyst embryos, a 3 is great. If you have a 3AA and a 4AA, we'd choose the 4AA. It's a little bit further along in development. A 5AA would mean that it's hatching out, so we would probably choose that one. But most of our embryos on day 5, I would say, are going to be a 3, at around a 3. And then embryos that are day 6 would be a little more likely to be 4s or 5s because they've had a little more time to grow. So I guess I should explain too. So if it's a 4AA or 4AB, the first letter is the grade of the inner cell mass, which is what develops into the baby. And then the second letter is the grade of the trophectoderm, and that's what develops into the placenta and the amniotic sac. So I think I have my picture that I've shown a few other times. So this would be an AA. So that concentrated ball of cells in the middle, that's the inner cell mass. And then all the bumpy cells on the outside, that's the trophectoderm. So we're grading the two different parts of the embryo. And then this would be a 4 because it's pretty big, it's pretty expanded, and the outer shell is thinning. So the zona is getting thinner, which is when it's preparing to hatch. This is kind of a fun question. What's the most significant discovery we've made through our research? So we don't actually do research here. We are all clinical, so just making babies. But in the field of IVF itself, I would probably say either ICSI or cryopreservation. So being able to inject one sperm into each egg without damaging the egg has been amazing, especially for male factor infertility. And then cryopreservation, as I was saying before, freezing and thawing eggs and embryos safely is just incredible. Is a PESA frozen sperm quality as good as fresh? We always say that fresh is best, but we would have to look at your sample specifically. Sometimes we have really great PESAs with lots of sperm, lots of motility, and I wouldn't, have any concerns about thawing and using that sample. Sometimes we have frozen PESAs that have a very, very small amount of sperm, and then when we go to thaw it, not all the sperm, always survive the thaw. Sperm's pretty delicate in terms of thawing, so I would have to look at what the numbers are for that specific sample and see if we would recommend a fresh sample. Okay, so what would be a reason to have a day 3 transfer? So if you have, 4 or less embryos, oftentimes the doctors will recommend a day 3 transfer. This is so that we're giving every embryo a chance in a uterus instead of in the lab. So it's really a numbers game, making sure we get the embryos inside you to give them a chance. A lot of times our older patients will do day 3 embryo transfers. You could transfer, some patients can transfer more than one embryo if they do a day 3 transfer based on their age and the quality of the embryos. All right, so we're just over a half hour here. I think I'm going to get ready to wrap up. I really appreciate all the questions. They're awesome. I come back the second Tuesday of every month. So I will be back next month. I'll look through your questions and it helps me decide what to talk about. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. And I will see you next month. All right. Bye-bye.